I don't really do keto anymore. I definitely wish I didn't fear insulin so much. Even the times when I was very, very strict, there are some things that I would definitely do differently now, because there were periods of time where my testosterone levels stayed relatively decent, but I had no sex drive. And I was symptomatic of low testosterone. I was able to consume a lot more in the way of carbohydrates than I thought I could without it impacting my ketone levels. I shouldn't have been afraid of a few carbs occasionally having an insulin spike, because
we are back again to discuss another low-carb guru who is leaving the low-carb keto sphere and making their way slowly to the bioenergetic sphere. In today's video, we're going to talk about Thomas DeLauer's recent video where he describes his process of quitting keto. Now, to be fair, before I start, I want to say that I actually respect Thomas for walking us through in his video some of the pitfalls that he ran into in keto and also describing some of the reasons why he decided to leave keto. I think there hasn't been that many gurus who actually openly walk through the process, so I think this type of information can actually be a bit valuable. Now, if you're interested in more content or seeing some of these other gurus who shifted, like Dr. Peter Tita or Dave Asprey, I have made videos on them as well, so you can check them out on this channel. But what I want to do in this video today is give you some insight on some of the pitfalls of keto and also some of the ways that you can correct those and reasons why or ways that you can transition off of the keto diet. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through Thomas's video, and then I'm going to add some key insights and points to some of the points that he makes. So without further ado, let's actually jump into this first clip here and get right into it.
So the first thing that I would have done is I would have consumed way more protein, mainly more red meat. Okay, when I was doing keto, originally it started out as a very high fat, lower protein thing. Then the research started to come out more that, fat is not necessarily all that you want to get. You want to get more protein, and protein's not necessarily going to disrupt the ketogenic process. But now, the way I look at protein is protein should be staple and everything else kind of falls after that. Fats are great, but fats don't provide us with nearly as much nutrition as, say, like red meat would, right? So I look back at sort of the nutrient voids that I may have had, and I wonder how many of them could have been filled if I was just eating adequate amounts of red meat.
Okay, so this is actually pretty good points here. And so I want to go through a couple of these, and I also want to show you some breakdown of what Thomas is describing. So the first things first is adequate protein is extremely important to maintain and build muscle tissue, especially in circumstances when you are in a relatively catabolic state. And so when you're running something like keto and maybe you have intermittent fasting going and maybe you're also exercising, protein is going to be absolutely key here, because all of those things, especially in combination with each other, are going to drive the catabolic stress processes and stress hormones like glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol, in conjunction with decreasing insulin signaling, which is a problem because adequate insulin signaling is necessary to have an anti-catabolic effect and to help lower some of these stress hormones. So having adequate protein in this state is absolutely essential, especially in my opinion and in my experience working with people coming from these different backgrounds. Now, the next thing that's important that Thomas brings up here is the fat sources in keto pretty much don't have any real nutritional value besides providing fat. And this is something that I show all the time to my clients, is that if I compare granulated sugar and butter or olive oil, besides the vitamin A in butter and besides a little bit of vitamin E in olive oil, there's no nutrition in the fats either. So you're not really getting this like super nutrient dense diet by adding in and having most of your caloric intake from fats. And so basically when we're running a keto diet, we're just adding butter or olive oil or some of these other fats into the diet. That can lead to pretty significant nutrient gaps, especially if the diet isn't situated appropriately in with other factors on board, like adequate protein sources, because these protein sources are going to be the major source of micronutrients. So what I want to do is I want to show you that a higher fat, lower protein diet can lead to nutrient gaps. And then I also want to show you the lack of nutrients in these fat sources. So in Chronometer, I've built out different example days of eating based on a keto diet, the way you would structure it in the research. So a keto diet We have a study here, Boone or Bain, ketogenic diets. And they say a keto diet is a very low carbohydrate diet with a moderate protein, high fat diet. It typically contains 70% fat, 20% protein, and only 10% carbohydrates. And so usually the target for keto is less than 50 grams of carbs per day. So I've structured a diet out here, not using red meat sources, which would be very nutrient dense, animal protein sources, which Thomas mentions. So if you're doing your keto diet with a lot of chicken breasts and things like this, you can run into nutrient gaps, especially if you're adding in a bunch of fat. So here we have a diet, 100 grams of protein. So that gives us about 21% of calories, 37 grams of carbs, which gives about 10% of calories from carbs. And then we have 153 grams of fat, which gives us about 70% fat for the diet. Now, when we look down here, we do cover some nutrition, but we're a little bit short on thiamine. Vitamin D is always going to be short for most people, unless you ideally would get this from the sun. And then when we come down here, we're pretty short on a variety of minerals. Now, something to keep in mind with some of these targets is that these are the daily recommended intakes. And so what that means is these are the amounts of these vitamins and minerals to prevent deficiency, not necessarily the optimal amounts. And so what we're seeing is on this dietary setup, which arguably is a decent dietary setup. Breakfast, you have eggs, spinach, and squash with some butter. Lunch, you have chicken, broccoli, squash with butter. And then dinner is a repeat of lunch. So it is a, mostly a whole food diet just with a lot of added fat, which would be, again, we'll see in a sec, equivalent to added sugar. And we're short on calcium, we're short on copper, magnesium, manganese, potassium, and zinc. So not really ideal in terms of hitting the nutrient targets that we need to hit. And fun fact here is not having enough thiamine is problematic for being able to use carbohydrates because thiamine is needed for an enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase that's essential in carbohydrate oxidation. So running a long-term keto diet and not having enough thiamine would be a huge problem. Now, what I want to show you here is that this diet is about 2,000 calories, but roughly, let's see, 50% of this diet comes from butter. So it's just added fats. And there's basically zero nutrition to the butter besides the salt that they add and some vitamin A. So essentially what you're seeing with this diet is this is a processed food diet and a low nutrient density diet because most of the calories are coming from butter, which does not have very much nutrients present. So in carbohydrate, like if you were to run a high carb diet, the equivalent here would be running like having chicken, broccoli, and squash and just adding granulated sugar or something like this to some extent would be equivalent to what's going on with the butter here because you're basically just adding fatty acids with there's maybe some special ones in there, not necessarily highest amounts, right? Like there may be some conjugated linoleic acid, which is why we see 5.1 grams of trans fats. But overall, it's not really nutrient dense. So this is probably, this keto diet is probably better than most keto diets that are being run. That's something to keep in mind. And we'll see that in just a sec because most people are adding in BS keto treats that Thomas also talks about that are nutrient poor. Like they're just fat. There's nothing else really, no value to them overall. Now, what we can see here is that if we shift the diet to incorporate more red meat, as Thomas mentions, we see that we can still get the same breakdown. So 100 grams of protein, 150 grams of fat, less than 50 grams of carbs. And all I did here was I took out the chicken and I put in ground beef 85% lean. And what we see is we're able to top off or get a bit closer to some of these different targets. But even then, it's still short on calcium, copper, magnesium, manganese, potassium, and maybe a little bit shorter on sodium and still short on thiamine. So this is still not ideal in terms of the dietary setup. Now, what you can do, to take this to another level, is if you're tolerating dairy, you can use whole food dairy sources like cheese, and you can lower the butter content. So what you do now is you have same breakfast set up as the past two meals, and then you have hamburger, broccoli, squash with cheddar cheese and only 1 tablespoon of butter. Instead of the previous day, we had 3 tablespoons of butter. And now we actually hit a couple more minerals. So we'll top off our calcium intake. We get a little bit closer on potassium, but we're still a little shy on copper, magnesium, manganese, and then also potassium, and still shy on thiamine. So basically, we're still a little bit shy here. You could add a little bit of some of the organ meats like liver in there to get some of the copper or some of the oysters as well. So we add a couple other things in. And so there's definitely ways to go to improve this diet pretty significantly. But again, this is getting to a more whole foods diet and lowering all the added fats, right? And this would be ideal to set this keto diet up appropriately. Now, what I want to talk about next is there's a couple things that Thomas doesn't mention in his clip that are really important to understand, and that's the carb to protein ratio is important. So having a higher amount of carbs than you do protein has been associated with lower cortisol values, and also in people who are training, higher testosterone to cortisol ratios, higher free testosterone to cortisol ratios, and overall lower cortisol values in general. So basically having a higher carb intake would actually be ideal, especially if you're training to keep stress low and optimize androgenic function. And then the next thing that I want to mention is that the normal adult brain requires by itself just about 120 to 150 grams of carbs per day in order to undergo its regular metabolic processes. And so if you don't provide that, then you will start to upregulate glucagon signaling to produce carbohydrate from the fats in your body and the protein tissue in the body, as well as release glycogen that's stored. And so we don't want to do that. That would be technically stressful, right? You have a lack of energy supply, so you have to rely on these adaptive hormones to break down your own tissues. And so I have a quote here, and what they say, the normal adult brain constitutes approximately 2% of the body weight and consumes approximately 20% of glucose in the body, so about 120 grams of glucose per day. In the nervous system, the aerobic metabolism of glucose is the main source of energy in the form of ATP. Most of this energy is utilized to sustain excitatory synaptic transmission. So what I did here is, say you still want to be on a lower carb diet, or you want to see how you do with a bit more carbs, you want to transition, well, you can improve your nutrient density and you can hit that carb target while still basically being on a low carb diet. So there's a diet here where I did low carb diet with red meat plus dairy plus fruit. And what I did was I basically removed all of the added fats, which is basically the butter. There's still cheese in here, 3 ounces with dinner and 3 ounces with lunch. And all I did was add a banana to lunch, a banana to dinner, and then 4 ounces of blueberries and 2 small mandarin oranges to breakfast. And now what we see, our protein intake goes higher, which I think would be better to hit that 0.82 grams per pound per day target that is ideal. So that gives 136 grams of protein per day. We get 120 grams of carbs, which is still low carb, and then about 120 grams of fat. So this gives us a 50% fat diet, 30% carb diet, and then protein is about 25% of calories. And we topped off all of the micronutrients except for thiamine. So perhaps we can add in some specific sources here to bump thiamine up. But besides that, we've hit all of the other micronutrients, all of the vitamins and minerals, just adding in a little bit of whole fruit to bring us up to 120 grams of net carbs per day, which again is still a low carbohydrate diet at only about 25% of calories. So really, this is much better overall in terms of micronutrients, not having a bunch of added fats, right? Because as we said before, if you just put a bunch of butter in your diet, you're not really getting too much nutrition as we see here. You just get some vitamin A and an added salt. So this is the first points that I wanted to drive home about adding in about the keto diet in general from a nutrient perspective, and then also from a protein perspective and adding in carbs, and so you could still be on a low carbohydrate diet. Here's a way that you can adjust. So let's jump into this next clip with Thomas, where we hear a little bit more about the nutrition.
The second thing I would have done differently, I would have put way more emphasis on potassium. I put so much emphasis on sodium because that's where a lot of the early literature was okay, you lose sodium, potassium, magnesium when you're on a ketogenic diet. Well, okay, so that would make sense that we would want to prioritize sodium. And we do want to increase sodium, but potassium always took a back seat. And this is based on what I know now. In fact, I literally just interviewed Dr. Jacob Torres out of University of California, Santa Barbara. And he was talking to me about how we need about 3 to 4 times the amount of potassium than what we think. Like 3 to 4 to 1 ratio is what we should be, potassium to sodium. Yet here we are, not really getting in much potassium and getting in lots of sodium. So when you start to lose those minerals and you add more sodium in, you might further disrupt that ratio. So I very much so would be paying much more attention to my potassium intake.
Okay, so let's go back to Chronometer really quick and we'll see the potassium gaps. So we do the keto diet without red meat. We're looking at only 3 grams roughly of potassium a day. We'll talk about the optimal target in just a second. If we go to the diet with red meat, we're looking about, again, 3 grams of potassium. If we add in the dairy, we're still at 3 grams of potassium. But when we add in the fruit, we go up to 4 grams of potassium a day, and that's just to get to 120 grams of carbs. Now, the optimal amount of potassium that I am shooting for on a regular basis with my clients is about 5 grams per day. And this is because at that level of intake, it starts to protect against the raise in blood pressure that you can see with sodium. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to be on a low sodium diet. It just means that you want to balance your potassium or your sodium to potassium ratios. And so ideally, the minimum that I try to shoot for is 5 grams of potassium per day, and then have it in a 2-to-1 ratio at least with sodium. So if you're getting 5 grams of potassium per day, then 2.5 grams of sodium would be the target. You could go to higher ratios, but I would at least shoot to that 2-to-1 ratio. And these are some of the ratios that are borne out in the research. And as Thomas mentions, there was a researcher who was discussing about a 3 to 4-to-1 ratio of potassium and sodium, which is harder to hit for most people because many people inside the Western world, according to the research, are less than 1 on their ratio of potassium to sodium. So basically, they have a higher sodium intake most times than they have a potassium intake. Now, this is extremely problematic, and I've discussed this in other videos, so you can check them out on this channel. But essentially, if you have a too much sodium in ratio to potassium, you can start to play around with something called your RAS system, your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And this has a negative impact on your kidney function and on your vasculature over the long term because the RAS system upregulates stress mediators like angiotensin 2, endothelin 1, aldosterone, and then the sympathetic nervous system, the catecholamines, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. And these all put pressure on your kidneys and on your vascular function. And so what they say here, I have a study, they say the main findings show that among the randomized controlled trials reviewed, the sodium to potassium ratio appears to be more strongly associated with blood pressure outcomes than either sodium or potassium alone in hypertensive adult populations. Recent data from the observational studies reviewed provide additional support for the sodium to potassium ratio as a superior metric to either sodium or potassium alone in evaluation of blood pressure outcomes and incident hypertension. So basically, this was a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And basically what they're talking about in this meta-analysis is that the people who have high blood pressure, which is usually a function of elevated RAS signaling, can help to improve their blood pressure values, or the blood pressure values are associated with their sodium to potassium ratios. So a lot of times with clients that I'm working with who have high blood pressure values, what I am doing is I am balancing their sodium potassium ratio in their diet, and I'm also balancing their calcium and phosphorus ratio and making sure that they're at least hitting that 5 gram potassium target per day. So I'm trying to get these minerals under control because they are involved with these stress systems. The RAS system, as I talked about for sodium potassium, and then the calcium, the phosphorus is involved with the parathyroid hormone system to take the pressure off the vasculature. So these are really important perspectives. Now, speaking of the calcium to phosphorus ratio, just briefly, what I want to show you is that if you do a keto diet and you're not tolerating dairy, the phosphorus to calcium ratio, or calcium to phosphorus ratio, is pretty terrible. So on this day that's the chicken, what you can see is that calcium's at 500 milligrams and phosphorus is about 1,200 milligrams. So ideally, you'd want to be at least 1 gram of calcium per day and a 1-to-1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus. But instead, what you're seeing here is a greater than 2-to-1 ratio of phosphorus to calcium. And then basically, you're not even hitting a gram of calcium per day. And that's the same thing for the red meat day, right? The red meat, you have about 1,200 milligrams of phosphorus and 500 milligrams of calcium. So overall, these are not ideal targets to be running with for mineral balance long term. Now, with that said, let's jump into the next clip where Thomas starts to tell us about saturated fats. This one's quite interesting. I think a lot of people may be frustrated about this one.
Number 4 is I would have controlled my saturated fat intake more. Hear me out on this. We know now, well, we did know then, but we were in kind of an echo chamber. If you look at a lot of the literature, saturated fat in abundance, in an overcaloric state, is definitely a contributor to insulin resistance as well. It's not just sugar, and it's not just saturated fat, but when you look at them individually in high amounts, they can cause a fatty liver. They can cause insulin resistance. And the big reason that I did keto in the first place was I was type 2 diabetic when I was very overweight. So when I try to fix that by just adding something that is also not exactly good for insulin resistance, when you look at the literature, I think I could have ended up a lot further along, a lot faster, if I had just focused on eating good quality meat and not tried to add extra saturated fat in. Because for a long period of time, I added extra butter, I added extra cheese, I added extra ghee because it tasted good and I could do it. And clearly it worked because I lost weight. But my health markers, my biomarkers didn't improve until I was long after I had lost the weight. So that's what's interesting. I dropped a lot of weight and my health markers didn't really improve until I had made some changes to my diet and I was at that lower weight for a while. I think I could have accelerated that more by possibly leaning into more of the fats from meat versus adding just a lot of cheese and butter in, and leaning into maybe the leaner meats and adding the fats from maybe olive oil and avocados a little bit more than just the saturated fats.
Okay, so there's a couple of things in here that are really important to talk about. One, let's go back really quick and just look at this. I'm going to add all this butter into my diet because I'm on keto mentality. Again, all this butter, we're getting basically 1,000 calories worth of fat, and it's low carb keto, so it must be healthy because there's no carbs. But in reality, what we're seeing is not so much nutrient density. You're really just getting vitamin A and nothing else. The salt is added because it's salted butter. So this is not ideal overall, obviously, because you're trying to run a nutrient-dense diet, and instead what you're doing is you're having the same foods, so protein foods that are providing nutrients to eggs, to chicken, and then maybe some vegetables which are providing nutrients, and getting all of your calories from added fats. So this is pretty problematic, and this is, I think, again, this is akin to running a higher carb diet and filling in your missing calories with granulated sugar or maple syrup or something like this, instead of reaching for some of the whole foods that have more of a nutrition profile. It's not to say that it's bad to have some added fats in the diet. That's not the problem. The problem is more so that if most of your calories are coming from that, then you're missing out on some nutrition. And again, you could just switch that butter over to cheese. And if we look at the cheese setup, the cheese itself, the 6 ounces of cheese in this day, is covering B12, B2, some vitamin A, all of the calcium intake, some phosphorus, selenium, and some zinc. The sodium, again, is added. So it is providing some nutrition, like some pretty decent nutritional value, especially because calcium will be hard to get without adequate amounts of the dairy in the diet. The next thing that I want to talk about in general is that adding heated fats, so adding tons of butter and especially cooking in tons of heated fats, is not ideal. And the reason this is problematic is because even though some of the fats are saturated, like tallow and butter, should be able to handle some of the heat, the cholesterol molecules inside these fats will still likely be oxidized by the high temperature heating with the cooking process. So it's not ideal to be eating all this heated fat on a regular basis. And if you were going to use olive oil, or you were going to use avocado oil or something like this, the monounsaturated fats, which you also find in the animal fats like tallow or lard, can still be oxidized or damaged by the heat, not to mention the high polyunsaturated fats. So another knock against adding in tons of extra fats into the diet. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Thomas mentions that his weight he was losing the weight, but he wasn't improving these other biomarkers. And this is something that's really important to understand, because if you're just seeing weight loss go down on the scale, that could be good, but it also may not be good, which is where you see somebody like Dr. Peter Attia saying he lost 20 pounds of muscle over 3 years doing his fasting regimens. And if he was just gauging by weight, he would say that's a good thing. But in reality, if you're losing muscle tissue, that's a terrible thing, because now your basal metabolic rate is going to be lower. And then also, when you do start to eat again, if you're not doing fasting or low carb or low calorie dieting, you're with the lower basal metabolic rate. When you try to start to eat again, there's high likelihood that you're going to put fat tissue on, especially because the body will want to regain some of that lost lean tissue. So it's really not good to be just gauging by weight on the scale. you want to actually look at a multitude of biomarkers and understand, like, am I losing body fat or am I losing muscle tissue? And then is my insulin sensitivity improving? Is my lipid profile improving? All of these types of things. How's my hormonal function? You want to look at multiple metrics so that you can get a sense of if you're trending in the right direction or not. And those can also include your general symptoms on a regular basis. Now, the last piece that I want to talk about is this saturated fats cause insulin resistance perspective. And so this is actually true. Saturated fats in higher amounts do impair insulin sensitivity more than monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats because they don't have double bonds. So the more double bonds you have, the less FADH2 you will produce that goes to the mitochondria. And then what winds up happening is you'll basically allow complex 1 to work better. You won't over-reduce something called the coenzyme Q shuttle. And then, so basically you won't produce so much ROS, which will improve your insulin signaling. However, this is in a short-term perspective, particularly with polyunsaturated fats. In a long-term perspective, as you start to incorporate those polyunsaturated fats into your membrane, they can become highly problematic for mitochondrial function and cellular structure because they are much more fragile, and the change in fluidity can be problematic with these fats. So ideally, that doesn't mean to shift all the way over to polyunsaturated fats. As Thomas mentioned, he talks about olive oil, avocado oil, and fat for meat, which does have monounsaturated fats, which are also okay. So you're really going to want to lean between saturated and monounsaturated fats. Plus, there's the off-target effects of these fats in terms of hormonal profile and also some of the different signaling. For example, some of the effects of something like oleic acid on sex hormone binding globulin, or some of the fats in coconut oil on testosterone and lipid peroxidation and things like testicles. So it's important to actually have a combination of these. And then the goal will be to still keep polyunsaturated fats low, because as they get incorporated into the structure, they can be quite problematic overall. Now, let's jump into the next clip here, where we talk about the keto treats.
Number 6, I would have gone a little easier on the keto treats, but the interesting thing is not just because they were hyper-palatable things and I was eating too many calories of them, because I definitely was. Like, I even look at like kind of pictures of me doing keto compared to now. Like, I was puffier, and like a lot of it was closely tied with the kinds of keto snacks I was eating at that time. And Dr. Dom D'Agostino mentioned something to me when I was on Mark Bell's podcast a couple months ago. He mentioned, well, Thomas, why were you getting so many omega-6s in? Because I made a comment about I probably should have like controlled my omega-6 intake. And he's like, Thomas, where were you getting omega-6s from? And I had to think about it, and I was like, oh, it was the processed keto food that I was eating, sunflower oils, things like that. Because Dom was like, hey, Thomas, outside of processed keto food, like, where would you even get a bunch of omega-6s unless you were eating ridiculous amounts of nuts, which you probably weren't.
Okay, so this is another good point. And let's jump back into our friend Chronometer here. When we look at keto treats, so I listed out some keto treats, keto protein bar, chocolate peanut butter pie, a keto bar, chocolate chip cookie dough, keto ice cream, another keto ice cream, and then more bars, right? A lot of people are eating these keto bars because, again, carbs are the evil thing. And so we just don't have carbs. Like, we could still eat all this other stuff. And to be fair, like, that is not true at all. Especially, I don't think carbs are problematic, but it also doesn't justify eating this stuff just because it doesn't have carbs. So when we look at all of these together, this is 1,000 calories. There's 41 grams of protein, 16 grams of carbs, 80 grams of fat. And there's no nutrition in this, really. I mean, maybe there's some iron and there's some sodium, which are likely added to some of the fortified components in here, possibly. Or it could be a function if there's some nuts and seeds in some of these. But in general, these keto products are the same thing as processed foods. Like, there's no real difference. We really want to be leaning towards a whole foods diet and not eating these things here because there's not really much nutritional value to them. They're just adding empty calories in the form of fat and protein without micronutrients and vitamins and minerals, and probably also not really adding too much polyphenol compounds. And then they also tend to add artificial sweeteners like erythritol and possibly things like sorbitol or maltitol, or some of these different artificial sweeteners, maybe acetylene potassium or sucralose, to keep the total carbohydrate intake low. And they also add problematic fibers, so synthetic or lab-produced fibers, fructooligosaccharides, inulins, things like this, that are likely to give you digestive issues, even though they're low carb. So these things, I think, it's no wonder that he was running into issues eating those foods because they're basically garbage, at least in my personal perspective. Now, the next thing I want to point out here is this is one of the big problems with keto and the way that's presented. People think that carbs are just the problem, and I don't think that's the case at all, especially when you start to go through the totality of some of the research. You start to see like, okay, there's people who are on higher carb diets who are improving a variety of metrics, losing weight, etc. So like, can it happen in keto? Sure, but it can also happen on low carb. And basically, I think the problem is polyunsaturated fats and seed oils, huge problem. So even if you're eating keto bars that don't have that much carbs in them, if they're made with sunflower oil or any of these types of things, still not ideal. Or even high amounts of nuts and seeds, probably not going to be ideal with that high PUFA intake. Number 2, processed foods are a huge problem. So adding in processed foods and thinking they're good just because they don't have carbs is, I think, not a good way to go about structuring out a diet. Nutrient deficiencies, huge problem. And so what we see here is this is not helping to solve those, regardless of the fact that carbs are low. Industrial additives, huge problem. And microbiome disruption, huge problem, which I just talked about with these different foods. So the problems I'm seeing with the standard American diet, or like why people are getting sick, isn't just because they're eating carbs. I think all of these factors plus more are much more likely culprits, and then trying to just say, oh, it's only the carbs, and then replace them with these types of foods that because they don't have carbs, even though they still have all those same other problems, I think is a highly problematic way to go about this. The next piece that I want to talk about just briefly here is this idea that, you wouldn't be able to get high amounts of omega-6s if you weren't eating seed oils or a bunch of nuts and seeds and you weren't eating processed foods. Well, actually, this is true, and this is a great point. So there's a paper I have here to share with you. It is titled Changes in Consumption of Omega-3 and Omega-6 Fatty Acids in the United States During the 20th Century. And so what we can come down here and see, we have a couple of graphs, and we could see the changes in the different sources of fat from 1909 to 1999. And what we see overall is what went up pretty high, shortening. Then we also see that's this red line here. Then we have margarine, which is pretty high. And what went down? Butter went down, lard went down, beef tallow is kind of stable. And we come over here, which oils increased in the diet the most? Soybean oil and canola oil went off the charts. So the most people back in the day, to the point that Dom D'Agostino and Thomas DeLauer are making, most people were not eating very high amounts of omega-3s and omega-6s, especially mainly the omega-6s that we're seeing today. And so we have another graph here that is basically showing the change in intake over time of these different fatty acids. And we're seeing is in terms of percent of energy, linoleic acid started at 2.3% and then went all the way upwards of 7% of calories, like went to quite a high level. Whereas omega-3s stayed pretty consistent, and so did things like arachidonic acid and then alpha-linoleic acid. So basically what we're really seeing is that the omega-6 content from linoleic acid, the ones that we see in seed oils, went super high. And so, yeah, if you had a normal diet or relatively normal diet 100 years ago or a little bit over 100 years ago, you really couldn't get that much omega-6 fats. And this is just an example to show you that this is one of the major things that's picked up in the diet. And it hasn't really been that much of a change in sugars over time, which we can see in this graph over here. We see a sugar intake is kind of relatively flat from 1909 to 1999. And so it's like, is it really sugars that was causing the problem? Is it really carbs? I mean, we're even seeing grains decrease, or is it the change in these fats? Now, this doesn't mean causation, but I would say the correlation here is probably very strong with some of these disease processes. Now, with that said, I want to jump into the next clip here with Thomas, where we watch Thomas talk to us about insulin.
Number 7, I definitely wish I didn't fear insulin so much. That came from being an overweight person. I was afraid that any presence of insulin was going to make me fat. That insulin was pro-growth, and that meant pro-fat accumulation. And there is no denying that we have an insulin issue. Hyperinsulinemia is a very real thing. But I also needed to understand that once I had recalibrated and was healthy, insulin was good for my recovery. And I shouldn't have been afraid of it. I shouldn't have been afraid of protein spiking insulin. I shouldn't have been afraid of a few carbs occasionally having an insulin spike, because a spike is supposed to come down And as long as you rise up and come back down and don't stay high, there's no problems. Another thing I would have done differently is I would have measured my insulin levels more.
Okay, so this is actually interesting to watch as we see these low carb gurus who previously bashed on insulin as a problem starting to say, oh, wait, maybe insulin isn't the problem, or maybe insulin's not the bad guy. Because we hear people still, like Dr. Robert Lustig, continuing to parrot the same thing over and over. Insulin's the bad guy, insulin's the bad guy. Well, it's not the bad guy. Under normal circumstances in healthy individuals, the presence of carbohydrates in the diet will increase insulin levels and blood glucose levels after a meal, and then they will come back down. That's completely normal. The elevated blood glucose and insulin that we are seeing in diabetes, obesity, impaired glucose tolerance, etc., is a function of metabolic dysfunction at the cell. It is not necessarily because the cell just doesn't want to respond to insulin because it's tired of it. There's actual problems going on in the mitochondria. And so insulin is this basically proxy marker, this indirect value, but it becomes the problem, but it is not the central issue. It is a bystander to some extent that can become problematic at certain levels once things aren't working appropriately. But it's like once things start to work appropriately, insulin will also be fine, which is why, for normal people, as an example, for myself and for many of the clients that I work with, insulin values come back down to normal once we take off the excess weight, once we get the metabolic circumstance under control, fix nutrient deficiencies, all these different components. You should be able to actually tolerate carbohydrates. And so going on a low carbohydrate diet doesn't necessarily fix insulin resistance. It just lowers your carbohydrate intake, and that lowers insulin levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your cells are then responding to insulin better. It just means you don't have any carbs coming in. And so it's good to see this shift. I'm happy to see this shift in the low carb community and start to understand there's different contexts where you have hyperinsulinemia with high blood glucose and these problems that are going on over here. And then you have normal people who will have insulin go up and down based on the food that they're eating on a regular basis. And we need this to happen because the insulin will lower the release of fatty acids, the glucagon signaling, and also has an anti-catabolic, anabolic effect so we can build and maintain our tissues and our structures so that we're not constantly breaking things down. So we want to actually have normal insulin levels. We don't want hyperinsulinemia, and then even having insulin too low can still be a problem overall. So, and the last piece I want to mention about this is there's been this these different people talking, like, I think it was Dr. Ben Bickman is saying things like, well, if you can't get fat unless you have insulin, and it's like, sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean just because insulin's involved in fat gain that having any amount of insulin drives fat gain. Now, I don't necessarily know, I'm not saying he has specifically said that, but I think a lot of people will take that with the implication that, if insulin's causing fat gain, and it's something that we see Thomas mention here as well, and this is not the case. If insulin levels are normal, if you're healthy, metabolic function's working well, if diet's set up appropriately, then just having insulin doesn't cause fat gain. There's more factors that need to come together to drive fat gain. And again, I'm working with hundreds of clients at this point who are on a higher carb diet, higher at least especially than the keto diet by quite a bit, and they're losing weight. They're not getting fatter. So it's not just insulin. Insulin's involved, but it's not necessarily, I think, the primary driver here. And that's important to delineate so that we can get rid of this fear of insulin that we see on a regular basis. And with that said, let's jump into our last clip here, where we're actually going to talk about cortisol and testosterone and some of these different hormones.
Number 8 is I would have monitored my cortisol more closely, especially in the beginning, because there were periods of time where my testosterone levels stayed relatively decent, but I had no sex drive, and I was symptomatic of low testosterone. Nowadays, eating a more, I don't want to say more balanced, but it is more balanced with more carbohydrates and more just adequate nutrition coming in, plus more activity, my testosterone levels are a little bit lower than where they were on keto, but I'm less symptomatic. I have better libido, I have better drive, better motivation, effort feels good, right? Now, during keto, those things were there, but not the way they are now. But they were better than when I was overweight. So I went from overweight feeling like complete garbage, to keto, feeling great, to now feeling way great. And it's not because keto's bad, it's because I did keto, got to the place I needed to be, and now I've been able to adopt different principles.
Okay, so a couple things. I actually see this all the time with many clients where testosterone values are high on low carb, so keto, carnivore, things like this, but they have symptoms of low testosterone values. And it's not just cortisol that's driving this. There's actually a couple factors that's driving this. Now, one of the big ones is I have guys who have come to me with really high testosterone levels, like over the reference range on keto or low carb, but their sex hormone binding globulin values are also super high. And so then they have symptoms of low testosterone. They don't have morning erections. They have erectile dysfunction. They don't have sex drive. They don't have ambition. They're not making progress in the gym. They're not recovering well. And basically, low insulin signaling can lead to elevations in sex hormone binding globulin. And there is a 4-week study on people in ketosis where we actually they say a mean increase of 3.47 and 10.94 in serum sex hormone binding globulin levels were achieved after 1 and 4 weeks respectively. So 4 weeks on keto in men, just 4 weeks, bumped sex hormone binding globulin up by 11 points, which is not a small shift inside the sex hormone binding globulin range. And imagine if you're doing this for months or maybe years, this lowered insulin signaling will lead to elevation sex hormone binding globulin. Now, why is this a problem? Well, one, this can lower the free testosterone level. So your free testosterone is the testosterone that's actually going to have the effect on the target tissue. And this is the testosterone that gets metabolized into dihydrotestosterone. And so if you have a high amount of SHBG, you could be blocking that conversion on these types of diets. Not to mention, if your keto diet is rich in oleic acid, as Thomas pointed out, with his changing his fat sources to avocados and olives, the high oleic acid levels can also drive up SHBG because oleic acid drives up SHBG. So this can lead to maybe your testosterone values are high, but if SHBG is also high, and then you can get low free testosterone and low dihydrotestosterone, which are the types and forms of the hormone that are actually having the effect on target tissue. So it's really important that you don't just look at testosterone levels. You look at these other factors to see what's going on and understand that the diet can directly change and affect these things overall. Another piece is if free testosterone is low and then your cortisol is raising on a keto diet, or your metabolism of cortisol, which there's studies showing that the metabolism of inactive cortisol back to active cortisol through the 11-beta HSD enzymes actually gets upregulated in the low-carb keto diets. So now you have a lowered testosterone value or free testosterone value, even though the total may be higher, and you have a higher general metabolism and level of cortisol. And so now you have a skewed ratio of free testosterone to cortisol, which is really problematic because cortisol is the catabolic hormone and testosterone is the anabolic hormone. And so you really want to have an optimal ratio of these, not to mention that you may see changes in the DHEA-S and cortisol ratio if you are doing fasting and you're doing low carb and you're exercising, all these types of things, by driving all this chronic stress, which is another problem because now, and we'll talk about this in a second, you basically have, again, a catabolic state with the excess cortisol in ratio to the DHEA-S and then also free testosterone. Now, the next thing that can affect these androgen levels is free T3 values on keto diets drop. So this is known. So people say, oh, well, free T4 and TSH is fine. Well, it doesn't really matter that much if free T4 or T4 and TSH are okay, because T4 and TSH don't have the effects of free T3 or T3 hormone. They're not the active hormones. T3 is the active hormone. So if T3 is dropping and you're seeing this happen on a low-carb ketogenic diet, then what winds up happening is your thyroid hormone is lower, even if your TSH and T4 haven't changed, and so you have lower thyroid hormone signaling. And this is known to happen inside the ketogenic diet. And I actually have a graph here to share. And what we see here on this graph is these are people who went on a high-carb, low-fat diet or the keto diet. You see your KD. And essentially what we see is TSH values change a bit, not necessarily that much. There's no rhyme or reason. But what we see here pretty characteristically, at every point when these individuals in this study went on a keto diet, T3 values precipitously dropped. And so we see with all these lines, we're seeing T3 just dropping all the way down when we get into keto. And then, yeah, maybe T4 is bumping up, but why would T4 bump up? Because it's not converting to T3, because you're basically the deiodinase enzymes and the conversion of T3. When you don't have adequate amounts of carbohydrates, their function will start to drop, and maybe you'll retain your T4, but you won't make the active thyroid hormone because you're not taking the carbs, and you may shunt it towards reverse T3, which would have an opposite effect of T3 on the tissues. So again, this can even worsen hormonal circumstances even further, because T3 and thyroid hormone are involved with the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone. So we're seeing multiple ways in which keto can alter these hormonal axes in a negative fashion. The last one I want to talk about is that cortisol to DHEA-S ratio. And basically, this is a good marker to measure if you're going to do the cortisol, if you're going to do the keto fasting and heavy exercise stuff, as well as caloric restriction, because as you're under chronic stress, DHEA-S values, DHEA sulfate values will drop, because the area of the adrenal gland, the zona reticularis, over time depletes with chronic stress and aging, whereas the zona fasciculata, the area of the adrenal gland that produces cortisol, doesn't deplete over time. And basically what you get left with is you get this chronic, the cortisol stays about the same or maybe elevates, but DHEA-S is lower. And this is problematic because DHEA-S's job is to protect us against cortisol's effects. And so we get unopposed cortisol, which can lead to immunosuppression, catabolic states on hormones and on tissues, muscle tissue, and organs. The cortisol can drive insulin resistance. It can drive mitochondrial dysfunction. It can lead to visceral fat gain. And also, it can lead to damage to the brain in terms of the hippocampus and memory. So we don't want to actually be having high cortisol, low DHEA-S values. And we don't want to have a bad ratio where we have a lower free testosterone level to cortisol ratio. These things are not ideal overall. And also, we don't want to be lowering our thyroid function, which these diets can do over time. And we can see that based on the free T3 and total T3 values, not necessarily the T4 and TSH values. So with that said, that wraps up this specific video on Thomas. I'd be happy to talk to him at any point in time about transitioning off of the keto diet and talk about some of these specific concepts, because this is what I'm doing with clients on a regular basis. And if you want to check out any the videos that I've done talking about the different gurus inside the low carb sphere of transition, like Dr. DHEA, Dr. Dave Asprey, you can check them out on this channel here. And lastly, if you need help or you're interested in trying to transition off a keto diet and setting up a diet specific to you, you can check out the nutrition blueprint at mikefave.com, which is a video series and a free video series and PDF guide that tells you how to set up your diet and how to adjust your macronutrients appropriately. So with that, I'll catch you guys in the next video.